A woman bought a rusty toolbox at a flea market for $5. The vendor laughed, saying she was wasting her money on worthless junk. But when her daughter's pet rabbit kept trying to squeeze into the toolbox, the woman realized this piece of scrap metal was concealing a secret that would expose a conspiracy decades in the making. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments about the most surprising thing you've ever found at a flea market. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Millbrook County, where the small town of Havenridge nestled between oak-covered ridges and fields of dying corn. With a population barely reaching 4,500, Havenridge was the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might live on the same street, where the high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, and where Saturday mornings belonged to the weekly flea market that transformed the community center parking lot into a bustling maze of folding tables and forgotten treasures. Margaret Chun had discovered this ritual 6 months ago, not long after her divorce had become final, and she'd moved to Havenridge with her 12-year-old daughter Lily to start over. At 42, Margaret was still adjusting to single motherhood, to living in a small town after 20 years in Chicago, and to the strange freedom that came with building a life entirely from scratch. The flea market had become her Saturday morning therapy, a place where she could wander without purpose, chat with strangers without commitment, and occasionally find small treasures that fit her modest post-divorce budget. Margaret worked as a freelance graphic designer, a career that allowed her the flexibility to work from their small rental house on Elm Street while being available for Lily's school events and activities. The transition from corporate life to small-town independence hadn't been easy, but it had given her something she'd lost during her marriage, a sense of autonomy, of making choices based on her own interests rather than someone else's expectations. This particular Saturday morning in late October felt crisp and promising. The maples lining Main Street had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys that had been awakened after the first frost. Margaret walked slowly between the rows of vendors, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands, taking in the familiar carnival of secondhand goods and weekend entrepreneurs. She knew most of the regular vendors by now. There was Mrs. Henderson, who sold homemade quilts and jam from her late husband's farm. The Kowalski brothers, who specialized in automotive parts and tools from their garage business. Young Sarah Martinez, a college student who made jewelry and painted furniture to pay for textbooks. These people had become part of her new community, friendly faces who remembered her name and asked about Lily's progress in middle school. Today, however, Margaret noticed a new vendor she hadn't seen before. The woman appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a wool sweater that had seen many seasons. Her table was positioned near the edge of the market, close to where the asphalt met the community center's lawn, and it held an eclectic collection of items that suggested she was clearing out a lifetime of accumulated possessions. There were Depression-era dishes, their patterns faded but still elegant. Wooden furniture pieces that needed refinishing but showed good bones underneath layers of neglect. Books with brittle pages and tools that bore the honest wear of decades of use. Everything was priced to sell, with small handwritten tags that suggested urgency rather than profit motive. Moving sale, the woman explained when Margaret approached. My name's Ruth Blackwood. I'm finally selling the old house and moving in with my daughter in Florida. 73 years in the same place. Can you imagine? I've got more stuff than Noah's Ark. Margaret smiled and began browsing the table. She had developed an eye for items that could serve dual purposes in her small house. Things that were both functional and had enough character to interesting rather than just practical. A ceramic mixing bowl caught her attention, along with a set of vintage kitchen towels that would complement her renovated 1940s kitchen. As she moved along the table, her gaze was drawn to a large red toolbox sitting on the ground beside Ruth's folding chair. The paint was faded and chipped, revealing patches of rust that had bloomed across its surface like abstract art. The metal handles were slightly bent, and one of the corner latches appeared to be stuck with years of accumulated grime and corrosion. How much for the toolbox? Margaret asked, surprising herself with the question. She wasn't particularly handy. The living alone had forced her to learn basic home maintenance skills that her ex-husband had always handled. Ruth glanced down at the toolbox and chuckled. That old thing belonged to my late husband, Earl. He was a maintenance supervisor at the textile mill for 35 years. Used that box every day until he retired in '89. Been sitting in our garage ever since he passed in 2010. I'd say $5, but honestly, I'd be happy if someone just hauled it away. The thing weighs a ton, and none of my children want anything to do with their father's old tools. Margaret examined the toolbox more closely. Despite its weathered appearance, it felt solid, substantial. The craftsmanship was clearly from an era when things were built to last, before planned obsolescence became a business model. She could see the faded logo of Industrial Tool Company, Cleveland, Ohio stamped into the metal near the main handle. "Does it open?" she asked. "Should," Ruth replied, though she didn't sound entirely certain. Earl was meticulous about maintaining his equipment. Even after he retired, he'd come out to the garage every few months to oil the hinges and check the locks. But it's been sitting untouched for over a decade now. Other shoppers moved around them, examining Ruth's various offerings. Margaret noticed a middle-aged man picking through a box of electrical supplies, and a young couple debating the merits of an antique rocking chair. But no one else showed any interest in the bulky, corroded toolbox that sat like a red monument to forgotten industry. The logical part of Margaret's mind pointed out that she didn't really need a toolbox this large. Her current tool collection consisted of a basic hammer, a set of screwdrivers, and various items she'd acquired as needed for minor household repairs. But something about this particular toolbox appealed to her newly independent spirit. It represented capability, self-sufficiency, the kind of practical competence she was still building in herself. "I'll take it," she said, reaching for her wallet. Ruth's face brightened with obvious relief. "Are you sure, dear? It's awfully heavy, and I'm afraid it might be full of nothing but rust and spider webs by now." Margaret counted out $5 bills, noting the concerned looks from other shoppers who had overheard the transaction. A woman examining vintage jewelry shook her head and murmured to her companion, "More money than sense." A younger man loading furniture into his pickup truck paused to watch Margaret struggle with the toolbox's weight and called out, "You sure you know what you're getting into?" Margaret ignored them all. 6 months of rebuilding her life from scratch had taught her to trust her own instincts over other people's opinions. Besides, $5 was hardly a major financial risk. Getting the toolbox home proved more challenging than Margaret had anticipated. Even with Ruth's help loading it into her Honda Civic, the weight strained the car's suspension and made for an interesting drive back to Elm Street. Margaret had to make several stops to rest her back and reposition the toolbox in the trunk to prevent it from sliding around during turns. By the time she pulled into her narrow driveway, Lily was waiting on the front porch with Pepper, her brown and white Dutch rabbit, in its small travel carrier. Saturday mornings were Pepper's outdoor exploration time, when Lily would set up a small enclosed area in the backyard where the rabbit could hop around on real grass instead of the indoor carpet. "What's that, Mom?" Lily asked, setting down the carrier and jogging over to help with the trunk. "Just an old toolbox I found at the flea market," Margaret replied, grateful for her daughter's assistance. "Thought it might be useful for organizing the garage." Together, they managed to wrestle the toolbox out of the car and into the garage that served as both storage space and Margaret's occasional workshop. The fluorescent lights hummed to life, casting harsh shadows that emphasized every dent and scratch on the metal surface. Margaret set it on her workbench, which was really just a sheet of plywood stretched across 2 sawhorses. Lily wrinkled her nose at the musty smell that emanated from the toolbox. "It smells like old oil and rust. Are you going to clean it out?" "Eventually," Margaret said, searching through her limited tool collection for something that might help with the stuck latches. "Might find something useful inside." The woman who sold it to me said her husband used it for 35 years at the textile mill. The main compartment opened with a prolonged screech of protest that echoed through the garage. Inside, Margaret found exactly what she'd expected: the accumulated tools and supplies of a working maintenance man's career. Socket wrenches darkened with grease, screwdrivers with worn handles wrapped in electrical tape, coils of wire in various gauges, and an assortment of bolts, nuts, and washers sorted into small metal containers. Everything smelled strongly of motor oil, metal polish, and the peculiar mixture of industrial chemicals that seemed to permeate workplaces where machinery was constantly maintained and repaired. It was an honest smell, Margaret thought, the scent of useful work and practical knowledge. Lily had brought Pepper's carrier into the garage to keep her company while she explored the toolbox's contents. The rabbit was usually content to observe new situations quietly from the safety of its carrier, occasionally thumping its hind foot if something startled it. But as Margaret began removing tools from the main compartment, Pepper started exhibiting unusual behavior. The rabbit pressed itself against the carrier's wire front, nose twitching frantically as it tried to get closer to the toolbox. Its small paws scrabbled against the carrier's plastic bottom, making tiny scratching sounds that gradually grew more urgent. Pepper had never shown this kind of interest in anything before, not even fresh vegetables or its favorite treats. "What's wrong with Pepper?" Lily asked, crouching down to examine her pet more closely. "She's acting really weird." Margaret paused in her sorting and watched the rabbit's agitated behavior. Animals often sensed things that humans missed, she knew. During her childhood on her grandmother's farm, she'd learned to pay attention when dogs barked at empty fields or cats refused to enter certain rooms. There was usually a reason, even if it wasn't immediately obvious to human perception. "Maybe she smells something interesting," Margaret suggested, though she felt a growing sense of curiosity herself. As she continued removing tools and supplies from the toolbox, Margaret began to notice something odd. The container felt disproportionately heavy for its contents. Even after clearing out several layers of tools, wrenches, and miscellaneous hardware, it still seemed to have substantial weight concentrated in certain areas. She ran her hands along the interior walls, feeling for irregularities or variations in the metal thickness. Her fingers, made sensitive by years of detailed graphic design work, detected something unusual near the back corner of the main compartment. The metal felt different there, slightly raised, and with what seemed to be the barely perceptible edge of a seam or joint. Pepper's behavior became increasingly frantic. The rabbit was now making small chirping sounds that Lily had never heard before, a high-pitched vocalization that seemed to indicate extreme agitation or excitement. It was pressing so hard against the carrier's front that its small pink nose was beginning to poke through the wire mesh. "Mom, I think Pepper really wants to get out," Lily said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "She's never acted like this before. Should I let her explore a little?" Margaret looked at the toolbox, then at the agitated rabbit, then back at the mysterious seam her fingers had discovered. "Just for a minute," she said. "But keep her close, and don't let her get into anything that might hurt her." The moment Lily opened the carrier door, Pepper shot out like a small brown and white rocket. Instead of the cautious exploration Margaret had expected, the rabbit made a beeline directly for the toolbox. Before either of them could react, Pepper had squeezed through a gap near the hinges and disappeared into the depths of the metal container. "Pepper!" Lily cried, reaching frantically into the toolbox. "Mom, she's stuck in there somewhere. I can't see her." Margaret immediately began removing the remaining tools more quickly, working with a sense of urgency driven by both concern for the rabbit and growing curiosity about what had attracted it so strongly. As she cleared more space, she could hear tiny scratching and scrabbling sounds coming from somewhere deep inside the box, but Pepper was nowhere visible in any of the compartments she could access. The scratching sounds seemed to be coming from behind the metal panel where Margaret had detected the unusual seam. This confirmed her growing suspicion that the toolbox contained hidden spaces, compartments that weren't immediately obvious to casual inspection. Act 3. Surface Discovery, 6 to 8 minutes. Margaret worked methodically to remove every visible tool and supply from the main compartment, creating piles of sorted hardware on her workbench. Screwdrivers in one pile, wrenches in another, electrical supplies in a third. The process revealed the toolbox's careful organization. Earl Blackwood had clearly been a methodical man who believed in having a place for everything. As she worked, the scratching sounds from Pepper's hidden location continued intermittently. The rabbit was clearly alive and moving around, but trapped somewhere that neither Margaret nor Lily could see or access through normal means. "Where is she, Mom?" Lily asked, her voice tight with worry. "What if she's hurt? What if we can't get her out?" "We'll get her out," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "First, we need to figure out where she actually is." With the main compartment now completely empty, Margaret could more clearly examine the interior structure. What she had initially taken for solid metal walls revealed themselves to be more complex. The toolbox appeared to have multiple levels and compartments, some of which were not immediately accessible from the main opening. She found 3 small drawers that slid out from the front of the toolbox, each containing carefully sorted collections of small hardware. Nuts and bolts in graduated sizes, electrical connectors organized by type, washers and gaskets arranged with mechanical precision. Earl Blackwood had clearly taken pride in his organizational system. But even with all the visible compartments empty, the toolbox still felt heavy, and the scratching sounds indicated that Pepper had found her way into a space that remained hidden. Margaret examined the seam she had detected earlier more carefully. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, she could now see that it was definitely artificial, a line where 2 pieces of metal had been carefully joined. The workmanship was excellent, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, but definitely present. She tried pressing on various points along the seam, looking for a release mechanism or hidden latch. Her fingers found a small irregularity in the metal surface, a tiny raised spot that felt different from the surrounding material. When she pressed it firmly, she heard a soft click from somewhere inside the toolbox. Suddenly, the back panel of the main compartment shifted slightly, revealing that it was actually a hidden door rather than a solid wall. The movement was subtle, but enough to create a small gap where none had existed before. "I think I found where Pepper went," Margaret said, excitement overriding her concern. "There's a hidden compartment back here." Working carefully, she managed to slide the false panel to one side, revealing a narrow space behind the main compartment. The hidden area was perhaps 6 inches deep and lined with what appeared to be waterproof material. And there, sitting calmly in the center of the space, was Pepper, surrounded by objects that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. The hidden compartment wasn't empty. It contained carefully preserved bundles of papers, photographs wrapped in plastic, and what appeared to be official documents, all arranged with the same methodical precision that Earl Blackwood had applied to his tools. "There you are," Lily exclaimed, carefully lifting Pepper out of the compartment. The rabbit seemed completely unharmed and oddly pleased with herself, as though she had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. But Margaret barely noticed the rabbit's rescue. Her attention was fixed on the contents of the hidden space. Even without examining them closely, she could see that these weren't ordinary documents. There were photographs that appeared to be taken secretly, papers with official letterheads and stamps, and what looked like correspondence marked with dates stretching back over decades. One photograph, partially visible at the top of a bundle, showed what appeared to be industrial equipment and several men in suits examining something that looked like testing results or measurement data. The image quality suggested it had been taken covertly, perhaps with a hidden camera. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the nearest bundle of papers. Whatever Earl Blackwood had hidden in this toolbox, it was significant enough to require careful preservation and concealment. The documents had been wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, protected from moisture and time with the same attention to detail that Earl had applied to maintaining his tools. As she lifted the first bundle, she noticed that it was surprisingly heavy and that there were more layers beneath it. The hidden compartment appeared to extend deeper into the toolbox than she had initially realized, possibly running along the entire back wall behind a false panel system. "What is all that stuff, Mom?" Lily asked, still holding Pepper securely in her arms. Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at the mysterious documents, feeling a growing sense that this discovery was about to change their quiet Saturday morning into something much more significant. "I'm not sure yet," she said quietly, "but I think your rabbit just uncovered a secret that someone went to a lot of trouble to hide." Cliffhanger ending. As Margaret carefully lifted the first bundle of documents from the hidden compartment, her hands froze. Visible through the plastic wrapping was an official letterhead she recognized from local news stories, the Millbrook County Industrial Development Authority. But the papers beneath it bore stamps and signatures from decades past, and the word "confidential" was stamped across every page in red ink. Whatever Earl Blackwood had documented and hidden away, it was important enough to seal behind a false wall where it could remain undiscovered for over a decade. Margaret's hands trembled as she carefully unwrapped the first bundle of documents on her workbench. The plastic had done its job. Despite decades in hiding, the papers inside were perfectly preserved. The fluorescent garage lights cast stark shadows across the pages as she spread them out, each one bearing the official letterhead of the Millbrook County Industrial Development Authority. "Mom, what do all those papers say?" Lily asked, still holding Pepper securely while peering over her mother's shoulder. Margaret scanned the first document, her graphic designer's eye immediately picking up on inconsistencies in the formatting and typography. "These are environmental impact reports," she said slowly, "but something's not right about them." The documents were dated from 1987 to 1995, covering the period when the Riverside Textile Mill had been the largest employer in Havenridge. But as Margaret examined them more closely, she noticed that multiple reports contained identical language, down to specific measurements and test results. The signatures at the bottom were photocopies, not originals, and several bore the same date despite supposedly covering different time periods. She reached for the second bundle, her heart racing. This one contained photographs, dozens of them, all taken with the kind of hidden camera that Earl Blackwood must have smuggled into restricted areas of the textile mill. The images showed industrial equipment, waste disposal systems, and most damning of all, pipes leading directly from the factory floor to the Millbrook River that supplied drinking water to 3 counties. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, studying a photograph that clearly showed toxic waste being dumped directly into the river during night shifts. The image was date-stamped February 14, 1991, Valentine's Day, she noted grimly. "But Mom, I want to know what happened to Mr. Blackwood." Margaret looked at her daughter's curious face and made a decision. Mr. Blackwood was a very brave man who tried to protect people from something dangerous, and I think some bad people made sure he couldn't tell anyone about it. Act 3. Taking action, 4 to 5 minutes. After sending Lily inside, Margaret photographed every document with her phone, uploading them to multiple cloud storage accounts. If something happened to the originals, she wanted to ensure the evidence would survive. Then she called the one person in Havenridge she thought might know what to do. Sarah Martinez, the college student who sold jewelry at the flea market, was studying environmental science with a minor in journalism. When Margaret explained what she had found, Sarah's voice became urgent and excited. "Mrs. Chun, this is huge. Do you know how many people have gotten sick in the river communities over the past 30 years? My professor always said the cancer clusters looked suspicious, but no one could prove anything. You need to contact the state attorney general's office immediately." But when Margaret called the State Environmental Crimes Unit, the response was frustratingly bureaucratic. Forms to fill out, procedures to follow, a promise that someone would look into it within 60 days. The casual indifference in the official's voice told Margaret that this evidence might disappear into the same bureaucratic black hole that had swallowed Earl's original complaint. That's when she remembered her ex-husband's college roommate, David Kim, who had become an investigative journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. She had his number from the Christmas card he still sent every year. "Margaret, I haven't heard from you since the divorce. How are you holding up?" David's voice was warm but professional. "I'm calling because I found something that I think you need to see. Documents about environmental cover-ups that killed people." 20 minutes later, after Margaret had described the contents of the toolbox, David was already in his car, driving toward Havenridge. "Don't touch anything else," he instructed. "Don't make any more phone calls. And Margaret, lock your doors and keep your phone close. If this is as big as it sounds, people have killed to keep it quiet before." David arrived 3 hours later with a photographer and a documents specialist from the newspaper's investigative team. They spent 4 hours in Margaret's garage, photographing everything, verifying the authenticity of signatures and letterheads, and cross-referencing the evidence with public records. "This is Pulitzer Prize material," David told Margaret as they worked. "The water contamination alone probably caused hundreds of deaths. But the real story is the systematic corruption. This shows how corporate money can completely capture regulatory agencies." The photographer, an older woman named Janet, handled Earl's documents with reverent care. "He was documenting genocide," she said quietly. "Environmental genocide committed by people who were supposed to protect the public." Act 4. The resolution, 3 to 4 minutes. The Philadelphia Inquirer published the first article 5 days later. The headline read, "Decades of Death. How a Textile Mill Poisoned 3 Counties While Officials Looked Away." Below it was a photograph of Earl Blackwood in his maintenance uniform, identified as the whistleblower they silenced. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the story had been picked up by national news networks. Federal investigators arrived in Havenridge the next morning. The current county commissioners, several of whom had been receiving payments in the 1990s, resigned in disgrace. The Attorney General announced a criminal investigation. But Margaret's life had become complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. Reporters camped outside her house. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, legal questions, and threats from anonymous callers warning her to keep her mouth shut. She and Lily had to stay with Sarah Martinez's family for a week while police investigated threatening letters left in their mailbox. "Are you sorry you bought that toolbox?" Lily asked one evening as they watched news coverage of the scandal from Sarah's living room. Margaret looked at her daughter, then at Pepper, who was contentedly nibbling hay in her temporary carrier. "No, honey, I'm not sorry. Sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." 3 months later, the verdicts began coming in. Former mill executives were sentenced to federal prison for environmental crimes. County officials faced corruption charges. The EPA announced a $500 million cleanup of the Millbrook River. Victims' families filed lawsuits that would eventually total over $2 billion. Ruth Blackwood, reached at her daughter's home in Florida, wept when Margaret called to tell her what they had found. "Earl always said someone would find his evidence someday," she sobbed. "He said the truth had a way of surfacing, even when people tried to bury it." Margaret had kept one item from the toolbox, Earl's small notebook where he had recorded his observations in careful handwriting. On the last page, he had written, "If something happens to me, I hope whoever finds this will be braver than I was. The people deserve to know what was done to them." The notebook now sat on Margaret's desk in her home office, a reminder that ordinary people can uncover extraordinary truths. The textbook's mill had been demolished, its contaminated buildings carefully dismantled by hazmat crews. In its place, the county planned to build a memorial park honoring Earl Blackwood and the victims of the cover-up. Final resolution. 6 months after buying a rusty toolbox for $5, Margaret Chin had helped expose one of the largest environmental cover-ups in state history. But the real transformation was personal. She had discovered that being a single mother in a small town didn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made by experts or investigators, but by ordinary people with the courage to ask questions when something doesn't seem right. As Margaret tucked Lily into bed one evening, her daughter asked, "Do you think Pepper knew there was something important in that toolbox?" Margaret smiled, thinking of the rabbit who had led them to evidence that brought justice to thousands of victims. "I think animals know a lot more than we give them credit for. And I think sometimes the universe puts the right tool in the right hands at exactly the right time." The rusty toolbox now sat in Margaret's garage, cleaned and restored, holding her own growing collection of tools. But sometimes, late at night, she would run her fingers along the hidden compartment where Earl Blackwood had preserved the truth for over a decade, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. If this story inspired you to never ignore your instincts about what's right, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to remember that one person really can change the world. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in the places no one thinks to look.